The hunter, 30, lean as fence wire, didn't blink as he pushed into it. He didn't mind being cold. Cold meant quiet. Cold meant no one was asking anything of him. His hound padded ahead, a lumbering shadow with one ear chewed ragged and a limp in the rear leg, more bone than bark these days. Old Buck had seen too much to spook easy, but tonight he paused at every bend in the trail. Nose twitching. Whine low in his throat. The hunter glanced up once, past the lip of his hat. Just snow. Just dusk. Just the world as it always was, empty and demanding. Then Buck veered right, growled, and took off. The hunter didn't shout, didn't panic, just followed. 20 yards down, the scent hit him too. Not game. Not blood. Something human. Something wrong. She looked like a ghost caught in midfall, curled at the base of a juniper with snow packed around her skirts like she'd become part of the land. Pale dress clung to her like it didn't belong, lay stiff with frost. The veil, Lord above, there was a veil, was twisted in the branches. Wind tugged it softly, like it was trying to free her or claim her. He crouched beside her. Hand steady. Breath visible. Her skin was like blue porcelain. Hair dark and tangled. Lips cracked. No movement save for the faintest flutter at her throat, barely there. Not dead. Not yet. He wrapped her in his coat. Lifted her like she weighed nothing. She didn't stir, not even when her arm slipped free and something tumbled from her grasp. An envelope, half-burnt, marked by soot and melted edges. Buck circled them, then led the way back. No questions. No explanations. The cabin came into view as night deepened, its roof thick with snow, chimney breathing faint trails of wood smoke. Inside, the fire was still alive from morning, banked low. The hunter didn't bother lighting the lanterns. Shadows were fine. They didn't ask where a man had been, or why he'd come back different. He laid her near the hearth, wrapped tight in blankets, boots off. Steam rose from the thawing of her dress. He fed the fire slowly, careful not to shock her with heat. Her hands were torn. Her nails split. There were bruises that didn't come from falling. He noticed without staring. Observed like he might observe a wounded doe, aware that even kindness could startle her further from life. She didn't wake that night. He sat with her anyway. Mended a broken strap on his rifle. Watched the way the light flickered over her face, drawing soft shadows over her hollowed cheeks. Once, just before dawn, she whimpered. Just a sound. But it cracked something open in him he didn't know still had edges. In the morning, he fed Buck. Chopped wood. Shoveled a path from door to shed. Routine held the world steady. When he came back in, she was awake. Not moving. Not speaking. But awake. Her eyes, wide and dark, locked on the ceiling like it was telling secrets. He didn't speak. Just knelt beside her and offered warm broth. She didn't take it. The next time, he tried again. This time she drank. Not all. Just enough. That was how the next 2 days passed. In gestures. In offerings. In silence that didn't feel cruel. He watched her watch the fire like she was trying to remember what warmth meant. Her voice came on the 3rd day, cracked and low. You didn't leave me there. He didn't look up from where he was peeling potatoes. Just said, wasn't planning to. She swallowed. The sound was rough. There was a letter. He nodded toward the table. Still got it. She tried to sit up. Winced. He moved to help but stopped halfway. She managed it herself, slow as rising fog. What's your name? She asked. He hesitated. Not out of secrecy, just hadn't used it much lately. Calder. She closed her eyes a moment. Then nodded like she'd heard it before, long ago. Her own name came later, when the wind had quieted and snow turned to sleet. Maribel, she said, barely audible. Maribel James. The fire cracked. Buck raised his head. Calder froze. He had known that name once. From a letter his brother had tossed into the stove with a laugh. From a parcel addressed in fine script that sat unopened for weeks until the ink faded. Maribel James. The girl back east his brother had courted through post, spoken sweet nothings, promised a ranch, a ring, a life. But he'd left before she ever arrived. Gone south chasing gold or glory or another woman. Calder hadn't seen him since. Now here she was, wearing the remnants of a wedding dress in his cabin. Skin bruised by the world. Voice like wind through dry grass. She didn't recognize him. Of course she didn't. She wouldn't know the older brother. The one who'd stayed behind. The one who buried their father when the fever took him. The one who never replied to those letters because he figured it wasn't his place. She didn't ask about his silence, and he didn't offer it. Later that night, while she dozed beneath a pile of quilts, Calder dug out the tin box from beneath the floorboards. The one with his father's belongings and old papers. Inside, folded twice and watermarked, was the ledger his father kept. Scratched between cattle sales and seed orders was a name. James, Maribel, arrival expected, February 1874. His father had written it like it meant something. Like he believed in what his younger son promised. Calder closed the ledger. Sat in the dark for a long while. He didn't feel angry. Didn't even feel surprised. Just hollow. Like he'd walked into a room expecting dust and found an heirloom instead. Fragile. Forgotten. Precious in a way no one remembered to speak of. She was sleeping soundly now. Breathing deeper. Her face less pinched. In the lamplight her features softened, sharp angles rounding out like spring beneath frost. He wondered how long she had walked before she collapsed. Wondered who'd seen her. Who'd turned her away. She hadn't told him her story yet. But it was etched in the blisters on her feet. The blood in her socks. The way she flinched from the shadow of his hand. In the barn the next morning, Calder found an old trunk of his mother's. Inside, a faded shawl, a pair of soft boots, a dried sprig of lavender wrapped in a ribbon. He dusted them off and set them by the hearth without a word. Maribel noticed. Smiled. Faintly. Wore the boots all day. On the fifth evening she asked, "Is this your land?" Calder nodded. "What's left of it? Do you like it?" He stared out the window a while. Snow falling again, soft and unhurried. "It's quiet. Quiet suits me." She looked at the fire, then back at him. "Me too." The dog slept with its head on her knee now. Calder watched them, something slow stirring in his chest, like embers finding breath again. He didn't know what she wanted. If she would leave when she could walk again. If she'd ever forgive the name she once came here to marry. But for now, she was alive. Air. Breathing the same warm air. And that was something. The storm that brought her had passed, but another one waited, quieter, heavier. Not made of snow, but of things unspoken. Still, Calder wasn't afraid of storms. Not anymore. He'd already survived the kind that left you standing alone in the ruins. And this time, someone had survived with him. The mornings came slow and pale, the kind that carried no birdsong, only the shifting creak of trees under wind. Inside the cabin, warmth lived in careful places, between the bricks of the hearth, beneath the shawl draped around her shoulders, and in the quiet rituals Calder never commented on. A kettle always steaming, bread thick with honey. A coat draped over the chair closest to the fire, not offered, just left there. Maribel no longer asked if she was a burden. Her words were rationed like coin, and Calder seemed the sort to accept silence as truth. But still, something changed between them, minute shifts, like meltwater loosening frostbit stone. One morning, she found him sharpening a knife outside the door, sleeves rolled, hat tugged low. She watched him through the window for a long time before stepping out barefoot. The snow was mostly gone from the stoop. The chill bit through the wood but not her skin. "You always work like that?" she asked. He looked up, eyes unreadable. "Only when there's work to be done." She glanced at the blade in his hand. "That one's already sharp." Calder shrugged, but said nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was watchful. Alive. That evening, when she reached for the kettle, her sleeve tugged high. He noticed the bruises then, yellowing, long-fingered, layered one over the next like someone had tried to erase her with their hands. His expression didn't change. He didn't ask, and she didn't explain. But he placed the kettle in her grip so gently it made her breath catch. Later, while she sat cross-legged on the hearthrug, she whispered, "I waited 3 days at the station. The train dropped me in Coldwater, and I waited. Thought maybe he was late. Thought maybe I had the date wrong." Calder didn't move. Just leaned back in his chair, arms folded, gaze steady. She went on, slower now, like the words were being pulled from a deep well. People stared. "I tried to ask for him, but they didn't know his name. Some said he'd never lived there. One man said he'd gone south. Another swore he saw him in Kansas months ago with a different woman." She pulled the shawl tighter, her hands trembling. "I ran out of money. I couldn't stay in the hotel. A woman in the mercantile told me to go back east. I told her I had no east left." Outside, the wind was rising again, brushing against the cabin walls like a dog asking to be let in. "I walked," she whispered. "No plan. Just thought maybe I'd find work. Or someone who knew him." The storm came fast. He didn't interrupt. Just listened, still and sure, as if giving her all the time she needed. When she finished, Calder stirred only to toss another log on the fire. Then he stood and crossed to the table. From beneath a tin of tobacco, he pulled out the old ledger again. She watched as he opened to a page near the back. "Here," he said. She leaned forward. Her name was written in brown ink, delicate and deliberate. Maribel James, arrival expected, February 1874. She ran a fingertip over the letters. "Your father." He nodded. "Kept good records." She stared at the page, then at Calder. "You're his brother." His jaw moved once before he answered. "Jonathan's brother, yes." She leaned back slowly. "You knew." "I didn't, not at first." Maribel didn't ask why he hadn't said anything. She saw the answer in the way his hands fidgeted with the ledger's corner. In the way his eyes didn't flinch but also didn't meet hers. "You stayed," she said instead. "He didn't." Calder gave a short nod. "He left a lot of things behind." They didn't speak for a long time after that. The next day, she mended the lining of his coat. He didn't ask her to. Just left it on the peg, ripped from shoulder to hem. She sat by the fire with a needle and thread she found in the drawer, stitching with slow, neat rows. When he returned from the barn, he looked at the coat like he didn't recognize it. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." He wore it anyway. They settled into a rhythm after that. Mornings were for chores. She helped stack wood, gathered eggs from the hens, though her body still ached in places she didn't mention. Calder worked mostly in silence, but now and then he asked her about little things. What kind of tea she liked. If she preferred sugar or molasses. Where she'd learned to sew that neat. "An aunt," she said once, "raised me after my mother passed. Always told me a woman should know how to put things back together." "She taught you well." "She didn't teach me what to do when something breaks that can't be sewn." Calder didn't offer comfort, just understanding. And somehow, that was better. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. Maribel startled, rising too fast, her hand instinctively brushing against the fire poker. Calder opened it slowly, his frame blocking the threshold. It was an older woman, gray braid, coat lined with fur. Her name was Mabel Cook, from town. She'd heard of a girl found in the storm. "Brought some cloth," she said, "and a pot of lard for the burn on Maribel's hand she'd heard rumor of." Maribel stayed near the hearth, wary but polite. Mabel chatted easily, more to Calder than her. "If the girl needs a place," she said, "we got a room above the mercantile." "She's staying here," Calder said, not harshly but final. Mabel's eyes flicked to Maribel, then back to Calder. "Ain't my business, but folks'll talk." "Let 'em," he said. "They'll do it anyway." Mabel didn't press. just left the cloth and the pot of lard and a loaf of bread that smelled of cinnamon. As she left, she gave Maribel a long look, something between worry and wonder. That night, Maribel made cornbread from the loaf. Calder said it was the best he'd tasted in years. She smiled, a real one this time. Maybe that's just the cinnamon. He shook his head. No, it's the cook. The next morning, he brought her a scarf he'd found in a chest. Soft wool, faded blue. She ran it between her fingers like she was afraid it might vanish. "You sure?" she asked. "It suits you," he said. That evening, as the sun draped gold over the snow-melt ridges, Calder brought in an old oil lamp from the barn and set it on the table. "Used to read by this," he said. Father kept it burning long past sunset. She lit it with a match, the glow painting her face in soft amber. "Then let's read." He pulled down a book from the shelf, an almanac, dusty but clean. They read aloud in turns, tripping over strange words and laughing quietly when she called a coyote a prairie fox. Calder's laugh came sudden and surprised, like it had been buried deep and forgotten. Afterward, she sat by the window, scarf wrapped around her shoulders, watching the moon rise over the trees. "I used to dream of wide spaces," she said. "Land where the sky didn't feel like a ceiling." "Dreams change," he said. "Some die. Some wake up different." She turned, met his eyes, and saw not a man rescuing her out of pity, but someone who understood what it meant to be left behind, who had chosen the long road instead of the easy one. That night, as she tucked herself into the cot by the hearth, she whispered something to the shadows. "I'm not angry at you," she said. He didn't answer. She wasn't speaking to Calder. Not really. But when the firelight flickered just right, she thought she saw him pause, just long enough to understand. Snow came again the next day, light and half-hearted. It blanketed the trees but melted fast on the cabin's roof. Calder stood outside, looking at the tracks leading away, his, hers, the dog's, faint paths threaded through the white. He didn't speak, but when he came inside, he hung his coat on the second peg. Not his usual one. Hers. Maribel noticed. Said nothing. Just pulled the scarf tighter and stirred the stew on the stove. In the fire's glow, something had begun to change. Not love, not yet, but something quieter, gentler. Trust, maybe, or the roots of it. The fire was smaller now. Not for lack of wood, but because they'd learned how to tend it gently. Keep it low, steady, never too hot. Calder said a fire too high burns through the night too fast. Maribel, who had once lived by stoves and lamps that only offered heat in brief spurts, believed him. The days had begun to lengthen, just slightly. Frost still clung to the eaves in the morning, but by noon the icicles wept. Sap rose in the trees. Crows had returned, distant and sparse, calling like old debts come back to be settled. Maribel moved differently now. Her steps were surer, though still cautious. She no longer flinched at door hinges or shadows across windows. The bruise on her cheek had faded to the color of smoke. Some nights she hummed while washing the dishes, soft melodies without words. Calder never interrupted her, never asked what the tune meant. He simply let her sing, and in the letting, something between them softened further. They did not speak of Jonathan. Not in name. Not yet. But pieces of him surfaced in their shared silences. Stories folded into glances, in the way Calder stared at the fire too long some nights, as if trying to find the outlines of someone he'd lost there. Maribel understood that kind of looking. She'd done it herself. On the train. In the snow. Even now, when the wind shifted just right and stirred the veil she kept hidden beneath the cot. One evening, while Calder was splitting kindling by the porch, she opened the small box she'd carried tucked inside her boot. Inside, the burned letter, the bent photograph of a house Jonathan had promised, and a dried flower pressed between two thin pages of scripture. She set the letter on the table and read it again, even though the fire had eaten most of the words. "My dearest Maribel," it began. The rest was ash-browned and charred at the edges. Promises half consumed. A trail of ink that ended in lies. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Grief had become something quieter, like the worn seam in a glove, felt more than seen. That night, she handed Calder the photograph. "He sent this with his third letter," she said. Calder took it without comment. The image was faded, nearly rubbed bare by her fingers. A whitewashed house, 2 stories, front porch with a swing. It looked nothing like their cabin. "He told me it was his," she said. "Said he'd built it with his own hands. Said I'd sit on that swing come spring." Calder studied the picture a long time. Then he handed it back. "It's from a catalog," he said. "Used to be one like that on the counter at the general store. Folks sent east for things they'd never see." Maribel smiled faintly. "I should have known." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You should have had someone who didn't lie." The fire crackled, sending up sparks. Buck, sleeping at Calder's feet, thumped his tail once before settling deeper. "I wasn't foolish," she said. "Just lonely." He didn't correct her. Didn't offer comfort or contradiction. Only said, "That makes 2 of us." Spring tried again the next week. The snow receded from the river, and the trees near the edge began to bud. Calder took Maribel to the bank one morning. The walk was short, but her breath came fast by the end. He didn't rush her. They sat on a fallen log, boots resting in mud that smelled of thaw and moss. "When I was a girl," she said, "I thought running away meant freedom. I dreamed of leaving my aunt's house, of being chosen by someone brave. Someone who saw me. And when Jonathan wrote me—" She paused. "I thought that was it. The beginning of everything." Calder looked out at the water. "And now? Now I think beginnings are quiet. And sometimes they come after endings." He didn't say anything, but he reached down and picked up a small stone, turned it in his hand, then offered it to her. "Smooth," he said. "River wore all the sharp off." She took it, rolling it between her fingers. It was warm from his palm. Back at the cabin, she set the stone on the windowsill. Beside it, she placed a second one the same color, found days earlier outside the barn. She didn't know why, only that they looked right together. That evening, she stitched a patch over Calder's shirt pocket. He wore that shirt every Sunday, though he never said why. "You don't mind mending things," he said, watching her work. "I like giving things another chance." He nodded. "That's what I thought." Later, while they shared cornbread and coffee, she told him about her aunt's garden, the way lilacs bloomed so thick in May that the bees sang until dusk. She spoke of lilac jam, of how it tasted like sunlight and soft endings. Calder listened, his expression thoughtful. When she went to rinse the cups, he stood and rummaged in the tall cupboard near the stove. After a moment, he pulled out a glass jar, dusty and half full. "Old Mabel's lilac honey," he said. "Bought it last summer, forgot it was there." She held it like it might disappear. "You'd share it. It's sweeter with company." She spooned it onto the last bit of cornbread, and for a heartbeat, the world was just the warmth of that bite, the memory of blossoms, and the man across from her, who never asked for anything he wouldn't offer first. Their connection deepened without ceremony. Not romance, not yet, but a recognition, a steadiness. The fire they shared was not one of flames, but of coals banked carefully, warmth rising in quiet, reliable pulses. One gray morning, Calder left to trade pelts in town. He was gone 3 days. Maribel kept the cabin, fed the hens, swept the hearth, wrote in the margins of old papers she found, just little things, words she hadn't said aloud. When he returned, boots muddy and shoulders stiff, he handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it slowly. Inside, a length of sky-blue ribbon, a tin of tea labeled marigold and mint, and a pair of gloves. Sturdy. Her size. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. He shrugged, looking anywhere but at her. "You've earned more than thanks." She didn't hug him, didn't reach for his hand. But she touched the gloves to her cheek, just once, and he looked at her then like he might never forget the way she did it. That night, the fire burned longer than usual. She braided her hair by the window, watching snow melt from the roof. "You've never asked why I stayed," she said. Calder paused in the act of setting a log on the flames. Didn't seem like the sort of question that needed asking. "I stayed," she said, "because here I breathe easier." He sat down slowly, the firelight playing against the worn lines of his face. "That's all the reason I need." The moment sat between them, untouched, like a letter unsealed. The following week, she found a bird's nest near the woodshed. Empty, but perfect. She placed it in the crook of the windowsill, next to the stones. Calder didn't ask, but when he added a feather he'd found on the trail, she smiled. "Things don't always have to be used," she said. "Sometimes they just have to be seen." His eyes met hers. "I see you." It was the first time either of them had said anything like that aloud. No flourish. No declaration. Just truth, dropped like a pebble into a still pond. After that, something shifted. He sat closer by the fire. She handed him her mending needle without needing to ask. He tried. His stitches were crooked, but she didn't mind. One evening, he passed her his mother's old Bible. She opened it carefully, flipping through the brittle pages. In the back, a list of names. Marriages. Births. Deaths. He pointed to a space beneath his father's name. Empty. "I haven't added anything since he passed," Calder said. She looked up at him, heart tight. "Would you?" he asked. "Write your name in?" Maribel didn't answer at first. She took the pencil slowly, her hands shaking a little, and beneath the empty space, in careful script, she wrote, "Maribel James, Spring, 1874. She left no title, no claim. Just her name, steady as a promise." The next morning, Calder found her standing outside, arms wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon. "I heard the river in my dream," she said. He stepped beside her, close but not touching. "What did it say?" She looked up at him. "It said I'm not done beginning yet." Calder didn't speak, just reached into his coat and placed something in her hand. It was the veil, cleaned, pressed, folded with care. "I thought maybe, someday, you'd want it again," he said. She held it to her chest, eyes shining, lips parted with a breath she hadn't taken in years. Then she looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him, and something broke open between them, silent and slow, like sunrise over snow. They didn't kiss, didn't embrace. But when she reached out and took his hand, he held it like it was the first true thing he'd touched in a decade. The fire behind them burned low, but warm, and neither of them looked away. The wind changed before he came. It came down from the north, sharp and dry, brushing through the tall grass like it was clearing its throat. Calder felt it first while checking the fencing near the edge of the property. Buck lifted his nose, ears twitching toward the horizon. Something was shifting. Not the weather. Something closer. More personal. Maribel noticed it too, though she couldn't have named why. The days had been kind lately, the kind that hinted at green things beneath the thaw. But that morning, the cabin felt different. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder, her fingers fumbling at the buttons of her shawl as if they couldn't remember their own rhythm. It wasn't until late afternoon that he arrived, riding in on a dust-choked mare with a crooked saddle and a too familiar smirk. Jonathan, younger than Calder by 3 years, but already frayed around the edges in the way of men who traded permanence for promises. His coat was too fine for the dirt he dragged in, and the grin he wore was one that had sold many lies and mourned none of them. Calder was stacking chopped wood by the barn when he heard the hoofbeats. Buck bristled at the sight of the stranger, growling low in his throat. "Well, damn," Jonathan said, dismounting. "Didn't think the old dog'd still be kickin'. Or that you would, for that matter." Calder didn't move from his work. His hands were steady on the axe handle. "Didn't think you'd be back. I wasn't plannin' on it." Jonathan patted his coat, brushing off invisible dust. "But you know how things go. Got a little business to sort out." Calder said nothing. His eyes locked on the man in front of him like one might watch a coyote circling too close to the hens. Jonathan sniffed the air, chuckled. Something smells good. You cookin'? Or is that her? The axe thunked deep into a log. Where is she? Jonathan asked, voice lighter than the question deserved. In the house, Calder said. Jonathan smiled wider. Good. I'll just... She's not yours. That stopped him. Not long. Just a flicker. But Calder saw it. She came here looking for me, Jonathan said, tone suddenly righteous. She's my bride. Got the papers to prove it. You had your chance. Calder pulled the axe from the wood with a single tug. You left her. You don't get to come claim her now like she's some parcel you forgot to collect. She's got my name. No, Calder said quietly. She has her own. Maribel stepped out onto the porch then, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. The late sun caught the blue ribbon in her hair, the one Calder had given her. She didn't say a word at first, just looked at Jonathan like he was a ghost dragged up from under ice. He took off his hat, dipped his head like charm might patch what abandonment broke. Maribel, he said, soft as honey left too long in the jar. You look, well, Lord, you're beautiful. She didn't move, didn't smile. I was headed back, Jonathan went on. I got caught up in Missouri, ran short on funds, meant to write, meant to send for you. Did you? She said. Not a question, just a simple wait. He nodded, too eagerly. I missed you. She stared at him. What was her name? He blinked. Who? The woman you were with in Kansas. His mouth opened, closed. That ain't what it looked like. Folks talk. They do, she said, voice like clean linen. So do you. Jonathan stepped closer. Calder shifted, but Maribel raised a hand. Not for defense, just finality. I walked through a blizzard, she said. Slept in a barn beneath a tarp. Thought I was dying. I didn't say your name out loud once. I stopped carrying hope like it owed me anything. He looked wounded, but not from guilt, only the sting of being seen clearly for once. I know I hurt you, he said. But we can fix this. Start over. She gave the smallest smile. It was colder than the wind. No, Jonathan. You don't get to start something you never meant to finish. But You left me, she said. That's not something a good man forgets to fix. Calder stepped forward, not looming, not angry, just present. Solid in a way Jonathan had never learned to be. She's staying, Calder said. Jonathan scoffed. That what this is? You think you can take what's mine? She's not yours. The silence that followed was thick, humming with the tension of old wounds resurfacing. Jonathan looked between them, finally seeing what had been building in the quiet. He shook his head, face tightening. You always were the martyr, weren't you? He sneered at Calder. Always playing the good son, staying behind, fixing fences, burying Pa. What's next? Gonna marry my leftovers. The words cut. Calder's expression didn't change, but Maribel saw the flicker. She stepped between them, calm and unyielding. I am not what you left behind, she said. I am what I survived. Jonathan sneered. And what? You think this place, this man, is gonna give you more? She tilted her head, studied him the way one might regard a faded coat with holes too large to patch. He already has. For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing. Then he spat into the dirt, turned on his heel, and mounted the mare. You'll regret this, he muttered. Both of you. Neither of them answered. They stood still, hand in hand without even knowing when they'd reached for each other. He rode off toward town, dust rising behind him like ash. Inside, Calder sat by the hearth. Buck curled at his feet, already relaxed. Maribel stirred stew on the stove, hands steady. He watched her, words forming slowly. He was right about one thing, Calder said. I did court a woman once. Long time ago. She didn't stop stirring, but her shoulders stilled. She died before we could speak vows. Fever took her fast. After that, I stopped believing there was more to find. Just worked the land. Kept to myself. Thought maybe love was something you only get once. Maribel turned to face him, eyes soft. Do you still believe that? He looked at her then, the firelight dancing in the glass of her eyes. No, he said. Not anymore. She set the ladle down, crossed to him slowly. He didn't rise. Just waited. Her hand touched his cheek. Not shy. Not tentative. Like she already knew the shape of him. Then don't wait, she whispered. Not if you've found it again. He leaned into her touch, eyes closing. And in that moment, the ghost of Jonathan, his charm, his absences, his empty promises, was finally exorcised. They ate in peace that night. No raised voices. No doubts. After the meal, Calder retrieved the small cedar box that held his mother's wedding ring. He didn't say what it meant yet. He didn't have to. Maribel traced the worn gold with her fingertip. It's not fancy, he said. No, she replied. It's strong. They sat by the fire until late, her head resting on his shoulder, the quiet around them full, not empty. Outside, the stars blinked through the branches. The wind no longer carried threat, only the hush of a season changing. Maribel did not speak of Jonathan again. She had already said all that mattered. And Calder, who had once made a home of silence, now found comfort in the sound of her breathing beside him. Proof that some stories are not stolen or spoiled, but rewritten by the hands that stay when others ride away. Spring came like a secret whispered into the frost. It didn't arrive with fanfare or bloom, but with quiet persistence. Melted snow slipping into the soil, crocuses pushing their stubborn heads through dirt, the creek behind the cabin singing just a little louder. Maribel rose earlier now. Not out of need, but choice. She liked how the air tasted before the sun caught it, like dew and wood smoke and wild things just waking. Inside, the cabin had changed too. Small things, almost invisible unless you lived there. The curtain she had sewn from old flour sacks fluttered when the window opened. Her comb sat beside his brush on the table. A second peg by the door now held her shawl, worn but whole. And beneath the window, a shelf Calder had built by hand cradled her books, her stitched scraps, and the little river stones they'd gathered side by side. They had not spoken vows. Not yet. But their days spoke them for them. In every meal shared. Every silence that didn't need to be filled. Every time Calder brushed wood shavings from her shoulder or Maribel laid a hand on his arm when a memory passed too close. Still, life had its own rhythm. One morning, Calder returned from town with supplies packed tight and an envelope folded into his coat pocket. He handed it to her without a word. It was from her aunt. Postmarked weeks ago. Brief, but not unkind. Heard you made it west. I hope he treats you well. If he doesn't, don't be afraid to leave again. Maribel folded the letter carefully, placed it in her sewing box, and said nothing. But that night, as they sat by the fire, she reached for Calder's hand. I did leave once, she said. But now I've arrived. He didn't respond with words. Just held her fingers gently, the way he always did, like she wasn't fragile, but worth holding carefully anyway. A few days later, the cabin filled with the smell of pine pitch and boiled starch. Calder had trimmed his beard, and Maribel had tied her hair up with ribbon. No one had said why. But they both felt the moment drawing near, as sure as a change in weather. Calder found the old family Bible again. The pages turned slowly beneath his fingers, creased and reverent. When he came to the back, he looked at the line below her name, the one she had written in the weeks before. He handed her the pencil. This time, she wrote more. Maribel James Calloway, wife, 1874. She looked up at him. If that's all right. He smiled. Not wide, just deeply. It's more than. The next morning, they walked into town together. The path was muddy, soft beneath their boots, but they didn't mind. Buck followed close, tail wagging low. They passed the place where she had once nearly died in the snow. Neither of them spoke of it. They didn't have to. Her feet were strong now, her steps steady. They arrived at the church around mid-morning. The preacher, a stout man with tobacco-stained hands and an honest voice, waited with a worn book in hand. No guests. No flowers. Just the wind in the grass and the quiet hush of sacred things. Calder held her hands while the preacher spoke. Maribel looked into his eyes, not blinking. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of love, not of beginnings. "I don't need vows on paper," she said softly. "But I'll speak them anyway. I vow to stay when it's hard. To listen when words are slow to come. To see you, even when the world doesn't." Calder answered in kind. "I vow to carry what you cannot. To leave the past where it belongs. And to keep the fire burning, low and steady, as long as we both draw breath." The preacher smiled, eyes crinkled. "Then by the power vested in me, and the land that bears witness, I pronounce you man and wife." They didn't kiss at first. Just touched foreheads, still as prayer. Then Calder leaned in, brushed her lips with his like a promise whispered beneath snow. They stayed in town just long enough to pick up flour, tobacco, and a bolt of calico she liked. On the way home, Calder paused by the river, pointed toward the east. "There's land beyond that ridge," he said. "A grove of wild plum trees. I was thinking, we could build something there. Bigger. With a porch for sitting. Maybe a swing." Maribel watched the way the wind stirred the treetops. "You want to start again?" "No," he said. "I want to grow what we already have." They marked the place with stones. Side by side. One smooth, one ridged. Like the two of them. Spring deepened. The hens laid more regular. The creek ran clear. And Calder began drawing sketches by lantern light. Simple lines, rough edges. She watched him from the corner of the table, fingers busy with stitches, but eyes full of wonder. "You never told me you could draw," she said one night. He shrugged, sheepish. "It's not art. Just plans." "They're beautiful," she said. "Like blueprints for a life." But not everything bloomed easily. One afternoon, a stranger rode up the trail, asking after Calder. A land agent. Said there were new claims being filed. The homestead would need to be registered again under the new territorial law. Calder's jaw tensed. "They'll want proof," he said that evening. "Signatures. Documents. Witnesses." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then they'll have them." In town, folks whispered when she signed her name beside his in the registrar's book. A few still thought of her as the woman who came for Jonathan and stayed out of pity. But most had learned better. They saw how she moved, unafraid now, eyes clear, spine straight. Mabel from the mercantile pressed a paper-wrapped gift into Maribel's hands before they left. Inside, a spool of lace trim and a note. "For the house you'll build. And the stories you'll write inside it." The new cabin rose slowly, timber by timber. Calder chopped while she hauled. He hammered while she smoothed the joints. They laughed when the first wall tilted. They danced barefoot across the floor once the planks were nailed in place. She painted the window frames pale blue. He carved a bird into the corner beam where the light hit just right. On the final day, they mounted a small wooden sign over the door. The Mercy House. Not for what they had been given, but for what they'd chosen to give each other. The night they moved in, it rained soft and steady. They stood on the porch, newly built, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table, and watched the drops blur the horizon. "I used to think redemption came in loud ways," she said. "Lightning. Apologies. Grand gestures." Calder handed her a cup of coffee. "And now," she leaned into him, "now I think it comes slow. Like roots. Like rain. Like kindness, kept going." Inside, the fire waited. Calder stoked it. Maribel unwrapped the lace from Mabel's parcel and draped it along the mantel. They didn't need much else. The warmth was theirs. The walls spoke of effort, not memory. Every board a testament to survival reshaped into belonging. Later that night, as the rain softened into mist, she laid beside him beneath a quilt stitched with old names and new hope. He pulled her close. "You were never a second choice," he murmured. "I know," she whispered. "You were just the first one who stayed." Sleep came gently. The dog snored at the foot of the bed. The wind curled around the eaves like a lullaby. By morning, the world smelled clean. Weeks passed, then months. People came by. Neighbors, travelers, a few seeking advice or shelter. They offered what they could. A meal. A place to rest. Maribel became known for her cornbread. Calder for his way of listening without interrupting. One day, as they sat on the porch with coffee in hand, a rider passed by. Young, curious. The wind wept like a woman left too long alone, dragging its sorrow across the plains in long, lonely wails. Rain lashed the roof of the homestead with a steady fury, soaking the timber down to its bones. Inside, the air was close and thick, lit only by a single oil lantern that guttered with every gust through the cracked window-pane. Ellen May's breath came sharp, shallow, clenched between her teeth like something holy she refused to release. She lay on a straw-stuffed mattress, soaked in sweat, with her knees drawn high and her palms pressed hard against the sheets. The labor had begun before dawn, and now the sky outside was black as pitch, clouds swallowing moonlight whole. Each contraction bent her inward like a tree bowing to the storm, and each scream was muffled into her own shoulder so the rest of the house wouldn't hear. But it was no use. They were listening. In the shadows near the hearth, the midwife moved like a shadow herself, quiet, sure-handed, worn by years and dozens of births. Her name was Ruth, though Ellen had only ever heard the in-laws call her the colored woman, like a tool rather than a person. But Ruth's hands were warm, and her voice low and kind. She murmured encouragements as she worked, her brow tight with worry. "Almost there, honey. You just hold on now." Ellen gritted her teeth until her jaw trembled. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known it could ache. But that pain, pure, consuming, was nothing compared to the deeper one that pulsed beneath it. The pain of knowing no one in this house wanted her to survive this birth. No one wanted these children, not unless they came out with broad shoulders and the promise of a man's future. She'd heard them whispering after supper a week ago, her belly heavy against the edge of the table. The mother-in-law, Mrs. Howell, had said it plain, "If she births girls again, we're done keeping her. We didn't take her in to feed beggars." The husband, her husband, had been gone almost a month now. Thrown from his horse during a hunt. Ellen had cried that night, not for him exactly, but for the cold way his family folded the grief away, like soiled linens meant to be burned. They hadn't buried him with tenderness. They'd buried him with bitterness, because he'd left them without a son. Her body trembled with a final push. Pain ripped through her spine, and something ancient and raw escaped her throat. Then, suddenly, relief. A cry split the room, sharp and hungry, followed by another. "Lord have mercy," Ruth whispered. Twins. Two small bodies, slippery and red with life. Ruth cleaned them swiftly, murmuring over their tiny limbs like a priestess anointing blessings. "They're girls," she said, with a weight behind the words. Ellen's breath caught. Girls. 2 of them. Beautiful. Perfect. As if God, in his quiet way, had given her double the love to make up for all that had been taken. She reached out, tears hot against her cheeks. Ruth tucked one baby into each of her arms. They were warm, squirming, seeking. She named them with barely a breath. "Clara," she said, touching the smaller one's cheek. "And Rose." But before the names could settle in the air, the door creaked open. Cold wind rushed through the room like a scold. Mrs. Howell stepped in, lips pursed, hands folded tight beneath her shawl. Behind her stood the brother-in-law, James, tall, thin, eyes sharp with something oily. Ruth stiffened. Ellen did not move. "Well?" Mrs. Howell asked. "What are they?" Ruth answered, even though the answer lay swaddled in Ellen's arms. "Girls. Healthy." James let out a breath that sounded like a curse. Mrs. Howell's eyes narrowed. "Girls," she echoed, flat as stone. "Twins, no less. God help us. No blessing. No welcome. Just silence heavy as soil. We'll need to make arrangements," she added coldly, and turned to leave. James lingered just long enough to meet Ellen's eyes, and in that moment she saw it, the calculation, the contempt, the promise of something cruel coming. The door shut behind them. Ruth gently wiped Ellen's brow. "They don't want you here, child," she said, soft as ash. "You know that now." "I've always known," Ellen whispered. "But now they don't want the girls either." Ruth looked at the babies, then at Ellen. "You got strength in you. More than most. But you listen to me now. Don't let them catch you sleeping too deep. Not till you're out of this place." Ellen nodded, the weight of it settling. Her girls shifted in her arms, little fists rising like buds breaking through snow. She kissed the crowns of their heads. That night, as rain beat against the window and thunder groaned like an old wound in the sky, Ellen did not sleep. She lay still, listening. In the barn, voices carried. James and Mrs. Howell, whispering, arguing in low tones. "She's no use to us," one of them said. "The land's not hers. She's nothing. Just do it clean. She's still bleeding. It'll look like she bled out." Ellen's stomach turned to ice. She waited until the sounds faded, until the air felt thin and mean. Then she rose, legs shaking, and wrapped the girls in the thickest shawl she could find. She pressed a kiss to the wood frame of the cradle Ruth had built from an old drawer and whispered a prayer. She stepped outside into the storm. Mud sucked at her boots. Wind slapped her face like an angry hand. She walked with the babies pressed to her chest, her body aching from birth and terror. No stars, no moon. Just the black prairie stretching out before her. Behind her, smoke began to rise. The barn. Or maybe the corner shed where she sometimes took water. Something was burning. Her escape had come not a moment too soon. She didn't cry. There was no time for that. Only movement. Forward, step by step. Lightning lit the sky, and in its flash, the plains looked like the sea, endless, cruel, and filled with teeth. But the girls breathed against her, and that kept her moving. Somewhere around dawn, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees near the edge of a creek swollen with rain. The girls whimpered, and Ellen cradled them tight. "Please," she whispered. "If someone's out there, if anyone's left kind, please." The clouds broke just a little. Enough for a shaft of pale light to fall across the clearing. And through it came the sound of hooves. Not thunderous, not fast. Just steady. A horse and a rider. Ellen tried to lift her head. Her vision blurred. She saw a silhouette, wide-shouldered, still as a tree. The man didn't move for a long while. Then he dismounted slowly and knelt beside her. She couldn't see his face. Just the outline of a hat, the smell of pine and leather, and a voice, deep and quiet. "You lost?" he asked. She tried to answer, but only a sob came. He touched the edge of the blanket that swaddled the girls. One of them reached a hand out in sleep, curling tiny fingers toward him. "Well now," he said softly, almost to himself, "ain't you all just clinging to life?" He lifted them all, her and the girls, into his arms, strong but careful. She pressed her face to his chest, against the beat of his heart, and let the dark take her. Back at the Howell house, no one noticed the cradle was empty until the sun rose. By then, the tracks were already washed away. And on a quiet hill miles away, a widower built up the fire in his cabin and laid 3 blankets near the hearth. He didn't know her name yet, but he would. In time. The storm had not broken, but something else had, an old bitter silence in the man's soul. He looked down at the sleeping woman and her girls and thought, maybe this is how something begins. Not with thunder, but with breath. And outside, the wind finally quieted. Dawn broke slow and sullen, dragging pale light across the battered earth. The rain had stopped sometime in the dark hours, but the sky still hung heavy with the memory of it. The prairie was slick with mud, each blade of grass bowed low. Somewhere behind her, smoke still rose, thin, acrid, clinging to the air like regret. Ellen May didn't look back. She moved with the halting gait of someone stitched together by will alone, her body a map of pain. Each step carved through her as though her flesh remembered the birth too vividly to forgive the walking. Her legs were wet to the knees, her hem soaked and stained. Her arms curled around her bundled daughters, who whimpered now and then in their sleep, unsettled by the shift in air, the cold, the soundless tension threaded through their mother's chest. She kept to the low brush where she could. The tree line was thin here, a scattering of twisted ash and cottonwood, their limbs still slick with rain. Her breath steamed in front of her, the morning air sharp and damp. A crow cried overhead, slicing through the silence with something like warning. There was no destination, only a way. Away from the Howell house and the two silhouettes who'd meant to let her die. She could still see the fire when she closed her eyes. The orange bloom at the shed's edge, the crackle and hiss as it ate dry wood. The plan had been clear. Trap her inside, say she never woke from the birth, let the flames finish what the family had started with scorn. But Ruth had come back. A forgotten shawl, a flicker of instinct. She'd seen the light through the cracks and heard the whispers. Ruth's warning had been the only thing that saved them. "I can't stay," Ellen had said, with one girl at her breast and the other pressed to her collarbone. "They'll try again." "You go east," Ruth had whispered. "Toward the river. There's old trapping paths there. Someone might help." Ruth had pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands, half a biscuit, a bit of dried meat, a sliver of soap, and vanished like smoke herself, knowing even her kindness had its limits in a land where skin color and poverty carved lives short. Now Ellen walked the path Ruth had sketched with words. East, through the wet fields, skirting fences and broken wagon ruts. Her back ached, her milk still unsure. The twins stirred more now, needing more than she could offer, and it broke her heart to feel her body fail them. "Not yet," she murmured. "Just hold on a little longer." The hours passed without name. Her thoughts came in fragments. A lullaby her mother once sang. The smell of yeast bread. Her husband's voice, always loud, always tired of her. The slap of his hand once when she'd spilled stew. His absence now did not feel like grief, but like air rushing into a place that had too long been sealed. Ellen had been 17 when she married. Sweet-faced and quiet, with hands trained to knead, mend, and hush. Her dreams then had been the soft, hopeful kind, maybe a home with windows, a man who smiled, a garden that bloomed in spring. But that was before the Howells took her in like charity, before her belly had grown and emptied twice with girls who didn't last, before they looked at her like a failed crop they couldn't afford to replant. But Clara and Rose, these two, were alive. And she would not give them up. By noon, the sun split through the clouds in thin, tired lines. Ellen found a patch of dry earth beneath a leaning pine and sank to her knees. She laid the girls down carefully, wrapping them tighter in the shawl. One of them rooted blindly, her lips parting, mouth searching. Ellen pressed her breast to the child's face, but the milk barely came. The baby mewled, frustrated, then quieted. Tears came then, soft and sudden. Ellen bent over them, her fingers shaking as they traced the down of their cheeks. "I ain't got much," she whispered, "but I've got breath. And I've got you. And I'll keep walking till that changes." She didn't notice the man at first. The silence had grown so constant it was its own kind of noise. But then there was movement, low and steady, a horse, leading itself along the trail with reins dragging and a saddle tilted wrong. Ellen reached instinctively for the babies, pulling them close. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a drum too fast for the dance. The man emerged slowly, on foot. He wasn't riding. He was walking beside the animal, one hand on the bridle, the other tucked into his coat. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a rifle strapped across his back. His boots were caked in mud, and his beard had gone mostly gray, though the lines of his face were not old, just worn like leather smoothed by years. He saw her. He stopped. Neither moved for a long moment. The wind carried a hush between them, brittle with tension. The man looked from her to the bundle at her feet, then back to her face. He said nothing. Ellen stayed crouched, every muscle tight as a sprung wire. Finally, he spoke. "You hurt." Ellen hesitated, unsure if the truth was a weapon or a plea. "Not yet," she said. He nodded once. "Baby's yours." "Yes." He stepped closer, not quickly. Just enough that she could see his eyes beneath the brim. They were clear. Tired, but not cruel. "You're alone." She didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. He crouched slowly, his knees popping. The horse snorted behind him but didn't wander. He looked at the babies for a long time. "You been walking long?" Ellen swallowed. "Since night." "From where?" "A place I don't care to return to." He looked at her again, studying. Not her body, not with hunger or judgment, but with a careful awareness of someone who's seen pain before and knows its shapes. "I got a cabin a few miles from here. Nothing fancy. Warm, though. Food. Dry clothes." Silence fell again. Ellen didn't trust easily. Trust had bled out of her with each false promise, each slammed door, each long night listening to her own sobs in a cold room. But the man's voice didn't beg or demand. It simply offered. "My name's Caleb Rourke," he said, standing back up. "You're welcome to come, or you can keep walking. But if you stay out here another night with them girls, you may not all make it." She looked at her daughters. At the red tinge in their cheeks, the flutter of eyelids too thin, too fragile. "All right," she said, after a beat. "Just until we can rest." He nodded. "All right." She gathered the babies and stood, her knees nearly giving way. Caleb moved forward, not to carry her, but to lift one side of her bundle. He didn't speak again as they walked. The trees thickened slightly, and the air grew colder. Ellen leaned on instinct and silence. Caleb didn't ask her name, didn't ask for her story. He just led the way. By the time the cabin came into view, the sky had begun to darken again. It stood at the edge of a rise, small and weather-beaten, with smoke curling from the chimney and a stack of split wood by the door. There were no fences, no signs of family. Just the stillness of a man who lived alone by choice. Caleb opened the door for her. The heat struck her first, rich with pine and ash. Then the smell of stew, faint but real. She stepped inside and sank onto a low cot he gestured toward. The babies fussed, and she tried to hush them with gentle murmurs. Caleb stoked the fire, added another log. He poured her a tin cup of water and placed it near the cot. Still, he said nothing. That night, she didn't sleep so much as float, half between rest and worry, her body too used to waiting for harm. But no harm came. Only the soft sound of the fire and Caleb's quiet movements as he cleaned his rifle and checked the door latch twice. In the morning, when light broke across the prairie again, Ellen opened her eyes to find a cradle beside her. Rough, handmade, crafted some time before dawn from scrap wood and old rope. It rocked gently with both girls curled inside. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring something in a pan. Ellen stared at the cradle for a long time. And for the first time in years, her chest ached not from fear, but from something else. Hope, maybe. Or the distant shape of it. She watched the man's back and whispered the smallest thanks. He didn't turn around. Just nodded once. And outside, the day began again. The days passed in the quiet way winter days do, slow and muffled, as if the world itself had wrapped in wool to keep warm. Snow fell thick most mornings, blanketing the hilltop cabin and the trees surrounding it in a silence so complete that even the crows gave up their chatter. The wind would sometimes moan around the eaves, soft and low like an old tune half remembered, but inside, all was still. Ellen rose with the dawn each day, not because she felt rested but because the twins stirred. Their cries were never shrill, just the small, needful sounds of life pressing itself forward. She fed them from her breast when she could, supplementing when she couldn't with goat's milk Caleb had bartered for weeks prior in town. He never spoke of the effort, just placed the jar by the stove with a nod, then disappeared outside with an axe or a rope or his rifle. At first, she didn't speak much either. Words felt too brittle, too fragile in a space this gentle. But she watched him. Caleb moved like someone used to silence. He worked with rhythm and purpose, cutting wood, hauling water, stitching leather. His every motion was deliberate, and yet there was no hardness in it. No flash of the flinching cruelty she'd grown to expect in men. When the twins cried, he paused whatever he was doing, not with impatience, but with calm attention. When she dropped a plate once, her fingers still unsteady from the fever that had passed through her days after arriving, he didn't raise a brow. Just swept the pieces and replaced it with one of his own. He gave her space, but not distance. She found herself humming again. Nothing fancy, just the old songs her mother used to sing while hanging laundry in the spring wind. Clara quieted to it quicker than Rose, but both girls stilled when Ellen's voice found its strength. One afternoon, Ellen stepped out into the snow for the first time since her arrival. The sky above was pearl-colored, and flakes fell slow, like feathers. She held the twins close, bundled in a thick wool blanket Caleb had given her. He stood a few paces away, chopping logs. The axe bit deep into the stump with clean, certain strikes. He looked over when she came outside but said nothing. She approached cautiously, every instinct still braced against unseen edges. But the snow crunched soft under her boots, and the smell of pine reminded her of childhood days before everything had soured. "I used to love the cold," she said, her voice catching in her throat. Caleb paused, leaned the axe against the log, and turned fully to her. "What changed?" "Life," she said simply. He didn't press. Later inside, she sat near the fire, the twins sleeping soundly in the cradle Caleb had built. She watched him as he worked a worn piece of leather into shape. A new holster, maybe. Or a pouch. His hands were rough but moved with the kind of precision born from repetition. "Do you ever get lonely here?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. The fire popped once, and a log shifted. When he did speak, his voice was low. "I did. For a long time. And now." Caleb looked at her then, not hard, not with meaning heavy and obvious. Just a simple, steady gaze that landed like warmth in a cold room. "Now I don't." Ellen swallowed the lump that rose in her throat. She didn't know what to do with gentleness anymore. It felt unfamiliar, like a language she'd once spoken but forgotten. The days continued like that, stitched together by small routines. She swept the floors, washed what she could. Caleb never asked her to. She simply needed something to do, something that reminded her she still existed in the world beyond fear and flight. The girls grew stronger. Their cries became more demanding, their fists clenched tighter. Clara developed a sharp, curious gaze that followed everything Caleb did. Rose was quieter, often falling asleep with her cheek pressed to Ellen's collarbone. One night, snow piled thick against the door, and the wind howled like wolves in the hills. Ellen sat near the hearth, stitching a tear in her sleeve. Caleb sat across from her, reading something old and battered. She couldn't make out the title. "Why did you stay here?" she asked, not looking up. He didn't answer at first, and she thought maybe he hadn't heard. Then he closed the book and set it aside. "My wife died here," he said. "So did my boy." The silence held like a held breath. "How?" she asked, gentle. "Fever," he said. 3 winters back. Took them both in the same week. "I'm sorry." Caleb nodded. "I was gone when it started. Traded traps into town. By the time I came back, she was near gone, and he followed her by morning." Ellen closed her eyes, the pain in his words like a mirror to her own. Not the same, but close enough to feel kin. "You stayed because of them?" "I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. And because something in me needed to keep building fires here. Chopping wood. Mending boots. As if keeping the place alive might bring them back." Ellen reached for the cradle, brushing her hand over the soft curls of her daughters. "You ever feel like grief starts to feel like company?" Caleb gave a low sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Most days." She met his eyes then, and something passed between them, an understanding made not of words but of weary hearts recognizing each other. Winter deepened. They did not touch, not yet. But they began to move like people circling toward something, not romance exactly, but a refuge. Trust came like thaw, slow and unseen, until suddenly there was water in the river again. One morning, she found a scarf folded near the cradle. It was hand-stitched, clumsy but warm. Caleb didn't say it was for her, but she wore it anyway. Another evening, she caught him watching her sing the girls to sleep. Not staring. Just watching with that same quiet steadiness. She didn't stop. And he didn't look away. Spring crept in like a secret. The snow melted slowly, turning to slush, then soil. The wind shifted, no longer cruel but carrying the scent of green things growing. The twins were nearly 3 months old when Caleb mentioned the town. "There's a trading post 10 miles off," he said, one morning over coffee. "I go every few weeks. Next trip, I could take a list if you need something." Ellen nodded. Then, after a pause, "Is it safe?" He looked at her carefully. "Safer than most. But folks talk. About me. About anything different." That night, she lay awake for a long time. The fire burned low. She thought about names, rumors, the past riding in like a shadow behind her. She thought about Mrs. Howell and the way James had looked at her like livestock gone sour. She thought about the shed, and Ruth's voice whispering her out. She didn't want to hide forever. The next morning, she asked Caleb for a pencil and paper. She wrote a letter to Ruth. She didn't know if it would ever reach her, but she needed to try. A week later, he brought back flour, matches, milk, and a bit of cloth for new dresses. He also brought back news. "Someone's been asking questions." "A deputy." Ellen stilled. "Looking for what?" "A woman and 2 babes. Said there's a family claiming she ran off. Stole from them." Her stomach turned to stone. "Do they know I'm here?" "No. I didn't say anything." He placed the bag of cloth on the table and looked at her. "I won't let them take you." His voice didn't rise. It wasn't a promise made in fire or blood. It was just said, simple, certain, like everything else he did. Ellen sat down, hands clenched tight in her lap. "If they find us, what will they do?" "Depends on who tells the story." She looked at her daughters. Then at Caleb. "Then we tell the truth," she said. "All of it. And we don't run." He nodded. "All right." The next day, he set up targets behind the cabin. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to steady her stance, how to breathe before the shot. Her hands shook, but her spine stayed straight. "You don't have to shoot to kill," he told her. "Just to be heard." When she hit the center ring, he gave a soft, approving nod. No cheer. Just quiet pride. The nights grew warmer. The girls began to laugh. Small, bright sounds like music. Ellen found herself laughing too. It was not constant, but it came more easily now, like a door unlatched. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep and the sky turned violet with dusk, she stepped out onto the porch. Caleb was sitting in the rocking chair, his hat tipped back, watching the stars rise. She sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke. Finally, she said, "I was nothing before I left. Just a name they called when they wanted something. Just a body they used." "You're not that now," Caleb said. "No," she whispered. "I'm not." He looked at her, and for the first time, his hand found hers. Not possessive. Not hungry. Just there. Warm, steady, real. They stayed like that as the moon rose. Not lovers. Not yet. But something had rooted deep. And inside the cabin, 2 babies slept beneath a handmade quilt, safe in the cradle built by hands that had once only known loss. The past had not vanished. But here, in this quiet, forgotten place, Ellen began to believe in a different kind of future. One where love didn't arrive with thunder, but stayed like a slow fire, tended gently, night after night. The air turned restless before the news came, the way animals grow quiet before a storm, the way a kettle sings before the water boils. Ellen felt it in the marrow of her bones. A pressure, a watching, though the hills still lay quiet beneath the warming skies of spring. The prairie bloomed in pale green, tiny blossoms daring to reach toward sun again. But something in the wind had shifted. Caleb noticed it too. He checked the traps more often now, walked farther down the ridge, eyes narrowing whenever he spotted dust rising on the horizon, even if it turned out to be nothing more than stray cattle or a trader's cart. His rifle, once leaned casually in the corner, now rested within arm's reach. Not with fear. Caleb was never afraid, but with readiness. Ellen spent her days busy with the girls, who now pulled at her skirts and babbled in soft syllables, their legs strong enough for steps when held. They filled the cabin with life, and laughter bloomed in corners where only grief had once sat like dust. Still, Ellen kept a bag tucked beneath the bed, bundled blankets, spare bread, a bit of coin Caleb had pressed into her palm weeks ago without asking, just in case. She never unpacked it. It was on a Tuesday when the knock came, not loud, not frantic, but deliberate. 3 raps, slow and spaced. Caleb was out with the mules, fixing a collapsed fence post along the north slope. Ellen stood at the sink, hands wet, heart rising fast in her throat. She dried them quickly and moved to the door, every inch of her trembling. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she glanced toward the girls, safe in their cradle, then stepped lightly to the window and peered through a narrow gap in the curtain. A man stood on the porch. Not old. Not young. Lean, with a coat too clean for a traveler and boots too polished for this land. His horse, tied to the rail, bore the mark of the county, stamped leather on the saddle horn. Deputy. Ellen opened the door a sliver, enough to see his face fully. Sharp jaw. Pale eyes. No warmth in them. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. Name's Deputy Lenvers. Out of Harrow Creek. I'm not from there." "No, I reckon you're not." He looked past her, into the dim of the cabin, eyes snagging for a second on the cradle. "Mind if I step in a moment?" "I do mind," she said, firmer now. He paused, then nodded. "Fair enough. Just here on a matter of inquiry. A woman disappeared from a homestead west of here some months back. Name of Ellen May Howell. Widow. 2 infant daughters. Some say she ran. Some say she stole. I'm just here to find the truth." Ellen didn't blink. "And if the truth is she ran because she feared for her life?" The deputy raised a brow. "That so? I heard it might be." He studied her for a long time. She didn't drop her gaze. Behind her, one of the girls gave a soft cry, half asleep. The man tilted his head slightly, as if weighing options. "Mind if I return with my superior? Sheriff'll want to ask a few things direct." "Do what you have to." He tipped his hat again. "Ma'am." Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off slow. Not hurried. Not defeated. Just steady, like someone who already had what they came for. Caleb returned before nightfall, and she told him everything. He listened without interruption, just nodding once or twice. "I should go," she said, voice thin. "No," he said. "You shouldn't. They'll come back. And next time, it won't just be words." "I'll be ready." Ellen looked at him, fear flaring in her throat. "You could get dragged into it." "I already am." He said it so simply, so plainly, it brought tears to her eyes. That night, they talked in low voices while the girls slept. Ellen told him more than she ever had. Not just what was done to her, but what it had done inside her. The way the Howells had unraveled her, piece by piece, until she'd stopped seeing herself as someone worth saving. Caleb didn't respond with pity. He offered her silence, the good kind. The kind that says, "I hear you and I will carry this, too." They spent the next days preparing, not in panic, but with quiet intention. Caleb repaired the hinges on the door, reinforced the window latches. He dug out old papers, land deeds, birth certificates, anything that might give weight to their truth. Ellen, meanwhile, wrote down her story. Not just for the law, but for herself. To see it on paper, in her own hand, stripped the shame from it. She kept it beneath her pillow, folded tight. When the sheriff came 3 days later, he didn't knock. He arrived with 2 men, all three on horseback, riding up the slope as if they owned the road. One of the horses bore the Howl brand. Ellen stood on the porch with her daughters at her feet, one on either side, their hands clutching the folds of her dress. Caleb stood beside her, silent, still. The sheriff dismounted slowly. He was tall, heavy around the middle, with a trimmed mustache and the look of someone used to being obeyed. "Afternoon," he said, removing his hat. "Name's Sheriff Larrick. I've got some business with the woman here." Ellen didn't flinch. "Then speak it." "I've got statements from the Howl family that you absconded with property and fled following your husband's death. That you set fire to their barn. I fled because they tried to kill me. The barn was meant to be my grave." Larrick narrowed his eyes. "Got anyone to back that up?" Ellen handed him the folded paper from beneath her pillow. Her account, in her own words. Names. Dates. Details only the guilty would know. "I do," she said. "I've got the midwife. Ruth Talmadge. She saw the fire. She saw me bleeding. She knew they meant to bury me quiet." The sheriff read in silence for a long while. Then he tucked the paper into his coat. "The Howells carry a lot of weight in Harrow Creek." Caleb finally spoke. "So does the truth." The sheriff looked between them, eyes narrowing at the edge of Caleb's hand resting close to his sidearm. "I don't want blood," the sheriff said. "Then don't draw any," Caleb replied. One of the other riders shifted in the saddle, uneasy. The sheriff took a breath, then nodded. "I'll look into this. You'll be hearing from the county soon. Might be a hearing." "We'll be there," Ellen said. The men turned, rode off with less swagger than they'd come. As the dust settled behind them, Ellen let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her legs shook. Caleb stepped behind her, hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "You did good," he said. "I thought I'd fall apart. You didn't." That night, they didn't speak much. They sat close, watching the fire. The girls slept between them, hands curled like petals. At some point, Caleb reached out and took her hand. No pretense. No promise. Just presence. And Ellen held on. Outside, smoke no longer clung to the horizon. Only stars. Only wind. And for the first time in her life, she believed she could face what came next without running. The letter came in late summer, pressed into Caleb's palm by the same lean deputy who'd once knocked on their door with suspicion in his eyes. This time, there was no badge pinned proud to his chest, no tension in his voice. Just dust on his coat and something tired in the way he looked at Caleb, like a man who'd seen enough to understand silence better than noise. "Summons," he said, handing over the envelope. "County wants her testimony." Caleb took it with a nod. No anger, no thanks. Just a firm grasp, a nod, and a closing door behind him. Ellen stood by the stove, one of the twins balanced on her hip, the other tugging at her skirts with a lopsided grin and flour-dusted cheeks. She didn't ask what the letter said. She already knew. Some things you feel before they're spoken. She read it that night by lantern light, the wax pooling slowly beside her, the flame dancing with the summer wind that threaded through the open window. She didn't flinch at the official seal. Her hands were steady, her mouth set. She read every word, then folded the paper and set it on the table. "I'll go," she said. Caleb looked up from the cradle where he'd just laid Clara down, his brows lifting. "They'll lie, Ellen. They always have," she replied. "That doesn't mean I will." He didn't argue. Just crossed the room and wrapped her in his arms, resting his chin against the crown of her head. "We go together." It took them 2 days to prepare. Caleb hitched the wagon, reinforced the boards, and packed supplies enough for 4. Ellen stitched clean dresses for the girls and a newer blouse for herself, one with sturdy buttons and long sleeves, simple but neat. She combed her hair in front of the mirror without shaking. She no longer saw a woman fleeing in that glass. She saw a mother, a fighter, a survivor who had outlasted storms. They left just after sunrise. The prairie stretched wide before them, the wheels creaking over familiar soil. The girls rode nestled in a basket between them, wide-eyed and curious, clapping their hands at every bird that darted across the sky. The town of Harrow Creek loomed by mid-afternoon the following day, rising out of the hills like a bruise, brown and clustered, its buildings hunched together as if bracing against judgment. Ellen had not seen it in almost a year, but nothing had changed. The same leaning sign above the sheriff's office, the same warped trough outside the saloon. Same faces, too, though many avoided hers. They lodged in a small room above the trading post. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a deep scar across one cheek, offered no more than a grunt and a nod. Caleb paid in coin and silence. The hearing was held in the church, its steeple towering above the dusty roofs like a finger pointed skyward, daring God to look down. Inside, townsfolk filled the pews like crows on a fence, murmuring low, their eyes swinging between Ellen and the Howell matron who sat stiff-backed near the front, wrapped in mourning black though her son had been dead near a year. James sat beside her, his lips pressed tight, hands folded like fists in prayer. Ellen held her daughters close until the woman from the county, the judge, gray-haired and weathered, with a voice like gravel soaked in tea, called her name. She walked to the front without trembling. They asked her to state her name. She did. They asked why she left. She answered. She spoke plainly, clearly, of the night of the fire, of the barn, of Ruth, of fear. She did not embellish. She did not beg. When her voice cracked, she paused, breathed, and continued. The Howells testified too. Mrs. Howell spoke of betrayal, of stolen goods, of disgrace and shame. James talked of responsibility, of family pride. But truth carries a weight that lies cannot shoulder forever. When Ruth Talmadge walked through the back door of the church, every head turned. She stood tall despite the hush that rolled through the pews. She looked at Ellen and gave a single nod before she made her way to the front. Her testimony came like a tide, quiet but unstoppable. She spoke of the fire, of Ellen's blood, of the whisper she'd overheard, of the night she chose to walk back, not because she'd forgotten a shawl, but because something in her heart had screamed that the girl was in danger. The judge listened with the patience of someone long past surprise. When it was done, she sat back, hands folded, and the room held its breath. "This court finds no grounds for charge," she said at last, her voice heavy with finality. "The matter is closed. Miss Ellen May is cleared of all accusation and is free under the law to pursue any life she sees fit." There was no cheer, just silence. But Ellen felt something in her chest unclench, like iron rusted through and giving way at last. Mrs. Howell did not look at her as she left. James met her eyes for a flicker of a second before turning away, jaw tight, shame flickering in the hollows of his face. Ellen walked out into the sun with her daughters in her arms, Caleb beside her. The sky above stretched vast and open. They left town the next morning. There was no need to linger. The prairie greeted them like a mother whose arms had always been waiting. The road behind them dusted over. The one ahead lay clear. 2 weeks later, Caleb proposed. He did not kneel. He did not offer a ring, not yet. He simply stood beside her as they planted early fall potatoes, hands dirty, the girls chasing moths near the fence line, and said, "I'd like to build a life with you if you'd let me." Ellen paused, her hands buried in soil. The sky was golden, the wind soft. "Not because you saved me?" she asked. "No," he said. "Because you stayed. Because you fought." She nodded slowly. "I want that too." They were married before the first frost, under the apple tree behind the cabin. No priest, just words spoken plain and honest, with the girls giggling at their feet and Ruth weeping quiet tears in the back row. Caleb carved 2 rings from seasoned birch and slipped hers on with a hand that shook just slightly. The fire in the hearth burned bright that night. And when they danced, slow, clumsy, full of laughter, it was not a dance of celebration alone. It was a dance of survival, of return. Ellen would always carry scars. So would Caleb. But in each other, they'd found more than comfort. They'd found reflection, restoration. The cabin grew fuller in the months that followed. With sound, with joy, with small shoes lined neatly by the door. With bread rising in the oven and songs hummed over washbins. with a woman who no longer walked like she expected to be chased, with a man who had learned to love not from abundance, but from loss. Sometimes, Ellen would sit by the riverbank in the early dusk, the water whispering at her feet, the girls asleep, and Caleb working in the distance. She'd close her eyes and let herself remember, not to ache, but to witness. She had lived through fire. She had crossed the river. And still she remained. One night, months after the snow had returned, she wrote a letter she never meant to send. She folded it and tucked it into a box beneath the bed, beside the first shirt she'd sewn with her own hands in Caleb's home. "I thought I would always be broken," she wrote. "But the truth is, I was only buried. And some seeds, when left in the dark, still know how to reach for light." Outside, snow fell quiet and soft. Inside, love burned slow and steady. And at the edge of the world, where the fire once threatened to consume her, Ellen had planted something that bloomed.